understanding a building's DNA in terms of its architecture or its history can give you some ideas about what to do with it. Again, going back to this idea that people have been adding on to buildings since they first created them, and why reinvent the wheel? Or why wind up with something like this? You know, this is not a hanging crime here, but we got a lot going on this building. We've got these sort of Moorish windows, 2 or 3 roof types sort of colliding into each other. A lot of fun.
The botched amputee figure.
And is this a bungalow anymore? I don't know. I've heard this. I don't want my house to look like this. What do I do? We know what we don't want to do. This is actually my neighborhood. And this is a very interesting and thought-through building. But does this look like it's always been there? I mean, we can tell which side's the addition. I don't know.
We wrote an article on this a few years back, and we figured there really were 5 basic parameters that if you pay attention to when you're trying to grow a house, you'll do it right. The first is the house fits its site, it fits its place. We call it the genius loci in Latin. Secondly, the house has a skeleton, just like an animal does. And the skeleton of the house tells you something about how it's going to grow and what makes it strong and stand up. We also found that oftentimes, even in vernacular housing, houses were built on proportional modules that tended to repeat themselves. And so that if you understand that there's a module that's there in your house, for instance, an I house has certain kinds of modules. An I house is a vernacular 2-story house. You can find good ways of adding to that module in a sensitive way. Then we also found that morphology or shape is something that many architects and homeowners don't understand. And that is that houses have characteristic shapes in their roofs. This is to shed water, but sometimes because they connect together in a certain way. And I like to point out that as a modernist architect, I was trained to design everything with a flat roof. You never used a pitched roof on anything because flat roofs were modern, and of course they leak all the time. But they style is very important. Well, we talk less about style than most preservation books do. Actually, a style is simply a way of doing something. Comes from the Greek stele, which actually was a writing instrument. And it's, so how do you write? What's your handwriting like? So the style of the house is important, but we feel it's more important to look at the formal types that the house might belong to. And there are a lot of different basic forms that historians have talked about, including the American Foursquare. And it turns out that when you're looking at, let's see, non-architect design houses, there really aren't that many different house forms out there, especially here in the eastern seaboard. Now, in the west, we have adobes and courtyard houses. It's a little bit different than here. But if you're talking about the Anglo-American colonies, there are very few different type forms for houses. And those are really more important than the style when you're starting to look at how to add to a house.
What we're leading up to is, I think, a major thesis that Mark and I enamored with, as well as, again, we're getting back to the idea, how do I make an addition on a house look right, look like it's always been there? Well, one way, and this is not a hard and fast rule, be inspired by ways that people have added on to houses in the past. And this is not just necessarily aping the past, but it's taking it, why reinvent the wheel? People have been doing this in this country, this continent, for about 300 years. And they've worked out some of these systems that not only look good, they're familiar to us, but they are efficient and they serve the needs of the buildings. This is just 4. The extension off the back that is often called a salt box is one idea. This is sort of something you see on high-style buildings. This goes back to the Renaissance. The main building here, and you put another sort of wing of the building over here, and you connect it with what's called a hyphen. Sometimes you do this on both sides of the building. Just to what's called a rear L, a smaller portion of the building off the back. And then a concept which gets a fancy name called unit repetition. Sort of just clone the building in one fashion to one side. Repeat it. This sounds like it could be dumb, but it's actually very common. You see it a lot. And the point is, it's been done well, and facade gets homogenized. And many buildings, such as the Cape Cod's originally on Cape Cod, were built as sort of like half houses, and then with the idea that when the sun comes along, we'll extend the building and sort of duplicate it on the other side, do a mirror image.
Yeah, the Dutch, actually we showed you a Dutch frame a little while ago. It was actually repeated when the grandson of the original builder decided to put an addition on the house. He used the same framing. But I see over in Pennsylvania, in Bucks County, there are lots of Pennsylvania houses. Oftentimes Quakers built them where they literally just extruded. They add a piece, then they add another piece. Sometimes they add a third piece that's smaller, and you have this linear kind of house that just sort of spreads along the site. And they're just getting more space as each generation needed more. The space was added on. And in fact, there's what you have, a telescope house. What I was talking about. Put it in here.
I was wondering if you were going to get to that.
Yeah.
I guess you'd call that a vernacular tradition.
Yeah, sure.
But
and again, it does seem to be sort of middle Atlantic. You see more of these houses than anywhere else.
What's the word vernacular?
It usually means unself-conscious, like the vernacular language. No architects, no planners, etc. Just folks building their buildings according to traditions that are passed on from generation to generation, usually by word of mouth.
sometimes it's a cultural thing. If you're from Scandinavia and you come to the United States, you bring your tradition with you. Sometimes it has to do with local materials, I would say. You're not going to, if you come from wood culture or you've got plenty of stone, you build with stone.
Yeah.
But no graduate school architect. Structure we'll talk a little bit more about, but simply that houses are built different ways, especially in time and place. This would be a timber frame type building, with heavy timbers and cross braces. Solid masonry buildings built out of stone. Around here, bluestone, another construction method. By the mid-1850s, we get 2x4 lumber stick-built houses. They're all work, but sometimes you don't even know really how it's built until you go behind the walls and see what the construction method is. And it pays to know what that is before you start adding on walls or knocking out partitions. In a timber frame house, for example, you can probably take out 2 or 3 studs and the building stands up fine. If you've got a stud frame house, you've got to put a header in there, otherwise you're going to start seeing sag portions of the building.
And I can't tell you how many times I find timber frame buildings in which somebody's cut the diagonal brace on the corners of those buildings. And that's a good way for the building to fall over. You can do that in a platform frame house, but you can't do it in a timber frame. Won't work.
Want to speak to this?
Well, this is our friend Henry Glassy, who's a wonderful vernacular historian, and he found out many years ago by going around what he called Middle Virginia that the English carpenters that had come over from Suffolk in England with their various means of building actually took with them some modular rules of thumb. And so when they put their houses together, they use squares, they use square and a half, they use all sorts of interesting proportions. And even though nothing was written down and there was no proportional handbook, all these houses were actually built in modules. Imagine that. Nothing written down. The humble carpenter comes over from England and starts building here, and voila, you have a proportional building, even as a vernacular. It's pretty amazing, and most good architecture has that.
One of the things that really makes traditional additions work is this idea of subordination. What is behind subordination? It's simply the less important parts of a house, vis-a-vis the original part of the house, which is what an addition really is. Should look like they're less important and make the main part of the house more prominent. And you can't pin that down, and you can't have a radar to actually test it. But certainly the additions that do look good tend to be subordinated. And what do we mean by that? There's probably four simple ways to understand that. Certainly make the roof of the addition lower. Whether these are additions or not is not necessarily a point for us today, but they could be. When the roofs are lower, we can clearly see what the main house is. When we forget about that, we get things like this. It's not a crime, but it kind of looks a little weird. Why does this have to be the same height here? Probably so somebody can have a train set upstairs or a kid's room or whatever. But it also creates sort of mechanical problem. Anyway, we were still a little unclear. It looks like the addition's trying to maybe, shove over the main part of the house. I think it could have been done a little bit better. This one, I think, is done better. And again, I wish these folks would adopt me, Anybody want to take a guess which side of this building is the addition?
The left.
Of the left, obviously. And it looks of a piece at the same time. It looks tasteful. This is more than just throwing money at the process.
Although in this particular house, the owners, they're not using the main entrance anymore because their garage is over on the left. So in a typical fashion, this little addition serves as a service wing, but also the main entrance now. And it's not such a little addition. It's quite large, so. Okay.
Another way to subordinate an addition is the position. Don't put it on the front of the house. That sounds obvious, but how many times have we seen additions on the front of a house? It's not a crime. There's no addition police. It tends to look better if it's on a less prominent side of the house. Setbacks. This is subtler, but what we're talking about is just offsetting the addition from the front facade of the house, or not having it in the same plane, especially when it's off to the side. This is a building I happen to have a lot of familiarity with in Maryland. And it's a Queen Anne style house. It's a sort of generic kind of late 19th century house. When I first saw this house, I said, what's wrong with this picture? It's not bad, but it looks like there's a bowling alley or something in there.
Yeah, it wasn't set back.
It wasn't set back. And once upon a time, there was a porch there. They filled in the porch. But how much better if they just sort of kicked it back by a few inches here so we could see the original outline of the building. And that's really what a setback does. It doesn't change, it's not like we're changing the volume of the addition and really subordinating it or diminishing it, but we're sort of framing the original part of the building because it creates a shadow line, and it's very effective. My last quick slide on this is, this is a little bit of a head ringer, but I think you'll get what I'm driving at. Is subordinate materials. There isn't really any hierarchy of materials in terms of historic houses or building materials beyond their cost. But, and there's plenty of examples to the contrary historically, but historic additions tend to be sort of like a lesser materials. You have a stone house, let's say, and somebody puts an addition on, it's often framed, or if maybe the roof is a little less expensive, things like that. This is just an idea to employ.
Yeah, or sometimes lighter material used as well, just to distinguish between one portion of the house and another.
That's right. Anybody want to take a guess where the addition is on this building?
Left. Yeah.
It's the left.
Yeah.
It's the left. This is a John Milner addition down in Bucks County. He's a wonderful architect. That's really part of my point. We're not sure where the addition is, but the addition, if this is the main part of the house, the addition, even though it might be bigger than the main part of the house, I don't know how far back this goes, it's certainly not overpowering it. We get the idea. We can sense what the original story of the building was. And even though this looks as a different material, it's of a piece, and it tells its own story.
Colors, of course, tie it together.
Color, yeah.
So there's a few of the rules about growing a house, and we have a middle section of the book where we talk about when you buy an old house, what do you do to understand what you have? One of the things that Gordon pointed out is literally you do nothing. You just live in it for a while and get to know the house. But you also need to probe a little bit, and what architects, professionals usually do is they will take things apart a bit and understand the construction, the concept, the condition, and really get a sense of where you need to start just with repairs before you plan a big addition to the house.
This is the number one question I've heard, and I know Mark agrees with me. And it sounds counterintuitive to say, you just bought a house and you have some vision for it, or you either are excited about improving it or adding space. It's hard to get your head around doing nothing. But that's what we're advocating. And this is not my idea. I have colleagues in historic landscape and even just the gardening field, and they say, you buy a house, you've got a garden. You want to plant tulips, or you love tulips? Well, Stick with the garden for a few seasons till you see what comes up. You may already have tulips. You don't know that, though, until the spring. So this is the same concept applied to houses. Look at your windows, too. People have been changing their windows on houses for about 150 years. This is not something that started with TV programs. To find the original windows on a house is rare. My point is simply look at your house first and count the windows and look at their condition and see how many different kinds of windows you have.
Not a Photoshop, by the way.
That must be a film auditorium or something.
I don't know.
But again, styles get a little tricky and people focus a bit too much on them. Again, we feel that it's better to look kind of at the bones of the building. But yes, the more elaborate the house, the more likely it may have been designed by an architect or done as a matter of a pattern book in the mid-19th century. Sometimes people feel the need to put a slightly different face on the house. And this happens to be a house I worked on in southern New Jersey in the glass-blowing town of Estelle Manor, and one of the main glass manufacturers was a man named Daniel Estelle. So he built this four-square looking house in late 18th century, about 1780, 1790. And by the time his great-granddaughter, Rebecca Estelle, got it, it had had 2 or 3 facelifts already. And what she did was she actually took all the Victorian gingerbread off of it, and she made it into this colonial revival house. It's still the same basic building inside, but you can see that it looks quite different when you apply a different, again, stylistic facade facelift to it.
The point we're hammering on, or at least touching on, is the house style is kind of like the costume. We can change our dress. We go, our ties get wider or thinner depending upon the decade, but the body pretty much stays the same. Especially a house at 150 years old might be 2 or 3 different styles sometimes.
Now, these are more of the type forms of late 19th, early 20th century, these pattern book houses that were literally sold to the public via books and magazines when people were buying these house kits that were sold. Here's Roebuck houses and so on.
Yeah, I throw in a bungalow here, depending on where we give this talk around the country, because these are relatively small houses, and that gets tricky to put an addition on, because if you have a huge building, well, you got a lot more latitude where you can hide it. And you're often sometimes almost attempting to double the size of the house. And I'm going to have a little fun here. Where does the word bungalow come from, or where do bungalows come from? The story is that they came from India, British colonial houses with big, wide, low, pitched roofs, and big open porches for this really hot, damp, steamy climate. Not having fun with you, but if we're talking about story-and-a-half buildings with low-pitched roofs and deep eaves and porches, we can't ignore the chalet either. And why did these folks build almost the same building up in the Alps with 10 feet of snow? It works there too. I don't really care where it comes from, but both of these ideas can be useful to us if we need to put an addition onto a bungalow. They've been building chalets for about 200 years or more, and they've been adding on to them, making like a small little mini chalet on one side, extending the roof on the low side, making a shed roof. This is not a surefire pattern, but rather than just sit in a dark room and trying to come up with an answer on your own, look to history. That's really my point.
The latter part of our book, we offer a few case studies, and what we did was we wrote to architects throughout the country and asked them, what have you done lately in terms of compatible additions to historic houses? In additions that were not what we call disjunctive, that is, not to be very contrasting to the house. And when we got our responses, they came in 4 different categories. First was, a lot of them submitted where they didn't do any additions at all. They just put all the new space within the footprint of the house. We call this new spaces in old places. We got a number of submissions of relatively small but very beautifully tuned additions, and we call these additions that stay in tune. That is, they're the kind of additions that you can't tell when they were put on. They look as if they've been there all the time. Then we did a chapter on row houses, because a lot of people do remodel row houses, and there are very important ways in which you can keep the neighborhood feeling in a good row house addition. And finally, we talked about the outbuildings when you can't get the space in any other way but by adding a new building, something outside of the footprint of the house. So just briefly, here are some of those case studies.
This is a Cape Cod style house out in Quogue on Long Island. Am I right that these are the additions in here on the back? You'd never even know it. This is up in Connecticut, and this is an 18th century house. This did originally have, from what I remember, a shed addition off the back, and then this is a modern addition. We can tell it's an addition, but it's not messing with the front of the house. This is Danielle and Norton McTavish. And this is what it looked like before.
Right.
And then these folks wanted a room, again,
Made it relatively small and fairly unobtrusive, and it's a sunroom, as you'd expect. This new space is in Old Place. This is a house called Red Gates, Harry T. Lindeberg House in Morristown. My firm worked on this probably 7, 8 years ago. And this was a house that was big enough for the family. The family had 5 children. It was a large, expansive estate. This family had quite a lot of money. And they didn't really want to touch any of the rooms in the house. It was a historic house, beautifully done. They simply did a little redecorating. But they did need a new eat-in kitchen and service area. So what we did is we just took the servants' rooms that were still intact from the 1920s. And so we didn't even gut this. We took out a few partitions and we created an eat-in kitchen exactly where the old kitchen was. We got a small office for the wife. We redid the breakfast room. And we got a lot of good new space without doing anything to the footprint of the house. And so it looks exactly the same from the outside, but we got some very good new space on the inside.
And my pet peeve is don't mess with the roof. I'll zoom right through this because this is more fun than anything else. I think talented architects like my esteemed colleague here can do this right. But when somebody tells you, oh, we'll just forget about the roof and go up or go around, watch out.
Well, if you have a certain kind of roof that won't allow that, you just have to say no. That's not the best way of getting the extra space.
When dormers take over the whole roof, are they dormers anymore? I don't know. Since the last time Mark and I gave this lecture, the fellow in the audience came around and he goes, Gordon, you got to have this photo. I said, well, okay.
But maybe they could have made it better and more interesting with like more windows or something.
Yeah. If you can't understand what really went on here, this is not the cheap way out either. What are they smoking? I don't know.